This program is brought to you by Emory University.
And so I want to welcome everybody today to the President's Commission on Race and Ethnicity. We have a very special lecturer, Dr. Mark Auslander, who will be talking about slavery and its legacies at Emory University, reflections on history and accountability. This is our second lecture in a series of lectures initiated by PCOR and the Slavery Reconciliation Committee, which is chaired by Blanche Birch. This is an exciting and busy day on campus. President James Wagner and Vice President Gary Hauk had hoped to attend, but due to their prior commitments with the Dalai Lama, they were unable to do so. The President and the Vice President, however, extend their regrets and their heartfelt support for our endeavors. In 2008, I had a brand new intern who was just one day out of Meharry Medical School. It was his first day on the job. He joined my service in the operating room at Emory University Hospital Midtown, the Department of Anesthesiology. And along with his enthusiasm, he shared a paper that had just been published in the Journal of the American Medical Association by the late Ron Davis. And the paper I have here is Achieving Racial Harmony for the Benefit of Patients and Communities. The paper apologized for 100 years of segregation and discrimination against American black doctors. This paper opened my eyes, as did the enthusiasm and energy of this young Emory doctor, Justin Young. I got the vision thing from him. It's like in Proverbs where it says, where the people have no vision, they will truly perish. But once you capture that vision of something bigger than yourself, you want to run out and share it with the rest of the world. I think the other message here is that you never know how a kind word, a gesture, a person or event can change someone's life. Well, mine was certainly changed by this young doctor, Dr. Justin Young, for sharing his vision and this article with me. Stand up for me, please, Dr. Justin Young. Thank you very much. See what you started. You never know who's going to touch your life. Just remember that. And so Justin and I, we talked, we began to ask ourselves, if the AMA has apologized, why hasn't Emory done so for its legacy of segregation and slavery? Emory, our esteemed institution, of which I'm very proud to be a member, encourages us to ask the tough questions, to constantly improve and evolve in our quest for academic excellence, and to challenge our institution to be the best. PCOR has allowed us to partner with Emory-sponsored mentoring programs with the help of our Senior Vice Provost, Dr. Ozzie Harris. Thank you, Ozzie. And with the new and beautifully renovated Career Center, thanks to the generosity of Laura Hardman and the Jones family. Mentoring gives us the direct opportunity to reach out and inspire the next generation of leaders. So, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Auslander.
Good afternoon. It is deeply moving for me to be here, to be back on the Emory campus, to see so many old friends and many new ones. The work I'm going to talk about today really emerges collaboratively, and I can't begin to thank all the people that have been involved. This is a process of research and serious scholarship, but also that is grounded in teaching and in community building. And key partners, I should acknowledge, are the members of the African American Historical Association of Newton County. Mr. John P. Godfrey, the treasurer of that organization, represents them here today. The Transforming Community Project, of course, PCOR, and all of this is leading up, for some of us, to a conference that's coming up that I'll just mention, in which the work at Emory and at other institutions is now branching out for a serious conversation about the fundamental relationships historically between institutions of higher learning and the institution of slavery, something that many of us were not sufficiently conscious of. And this, we're now bringing together, Emory will be hosting this in early February, scholars, activists all over the world who are engaged in these kinds of questions. The final day of that event will be a day of reflection. Reverend Matt Murphy of the Grace United Methodist Church family in Covington, who's actually here today, will be hosting us in that morning for a worship service, welcoming back many of the members of the community, including the descendants of enslaved families that built Emory College in so many ways, for a talking, and we'll move on to a talking circle that afternoon at Old Church. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but that's the context in which some of this work is happening. I'll talk a little bit today about slavery at Emory College. Some of you are familiar with the outlines of the history. For others, this will be new. This is closely related in many ways to the history of race and medicine in Methodism, especially at Emory and at the Grady's. And some discussion, which we'll all join in on, about what's the nature of restorative justice in terms of apologies, of other forms of restorations, of memorials, art, and forms of transformation. All of these are questions that I know PCOR and the committee are discussing all year, but this is an opportunity. I'll just mention a little bit about Methodism, race, and slavery. Emory, of course, is a Methodist institution at many different levels. Methodist emerged in the course of the Industrial Revolution, as some of you know, as an anti-slavery faith, celebrating the transformative power of human labor to create the self anew in new forms of freedom. So while John Wesley and the other major founders of Methodism were deeply anti-slavery, their mission was closely tied in, it's important to understand, with a medical mission. We can't really talk about Emory's history or about the entanglement of Emory and slavery without understanding the close proximity between Methodism and the emergence of scientific medicine. So Emory is a very special example, but it represents a more general pattern. So many of the great Methodist evangelists who bring in certain ways to many parts of the world a newfound respect for human dignity are deeply anti-slavery, and many of them are medical missionaries as well. David Livingstone is the most famous of these. Now, while the Wesley brothers did visit Georgia, came to Savannah, of course, their anti-slavery message was not entirely picked up by their Southern brethren, at least not in the white community. And that's one of the very fascinating things. And the context of the founding of Emory has a great deal to do with an alternate emergence within the global movement of Methodism, of an emphasis, at least in the American South, on the peculiar institution, an attempt to legitimate slavery. And that's the context, in fact, in which certain of the great schisms and splits and different movements within Methodism have emerged. Race has always been a central challenge. Race and human dignity have always been a central challenge for Methodism, but also the struggle for educational institutions and for medical training was from the beginning here bound up in slavery. Methodist evangelism, and this is the context in which Emory as an institution was created, was centered, interestingly enough, here in Georgia on outreach to plantation slaves. So James Osgood Andrew, the first Southern bishop in Methodism, was the first president of the Emory Board of Trustees. And he always said that the noblest prize of the gospel was outreach to plantation slaves. And for many of his colleagues, including several of his son-in-laws, to be a physician serving enslaved Africans was seen as a profound moral responsibility. Yet at the same time, in what seems to us an almost impossible contradiction, those same men were deeply committed to the ideological and theological justification of slavery. Well, how do we begin to make sense of this history? As we sit here on the Druid Hills campus, others, of course, work in Grady and elsewhere in the Emory-affiliated medical system, the traces of enslavery, while we can read about them in books, it's hard sometimes to see them. This campus in particular is sometimes spoken of as a history-free zone. You have to really work hard to move beyond slavery as and forms of segregation and labor exploitation, although one can certainly find those as you begin to look more carefully. The history is a little more visible on the Oxford campus, on the original campus, which is about 40 miles that away. And I must admit, I used to teach on the big Emory campus and had never really reflected on the history of slavery at the institution. It was really only once my students and I got to know each other out on the Oxford campus as we began to work with collaborators in the Oxford and Covington African-American community that I was forced to confront the legacies of slavery in the institution. And similarly at Grady, I mean, a great medical institution, as one begins to probe more to listen to the stories in a sense that the walls have to tell, that older staff members have to tell, one can begin to trace and reconstruct a deeper history about race and power, a great struggle for human dignity on the behalf of people of color who have worked and labored in Grady and its predecessors for many generations. But all of this is grounded in a long history of slavery that has to be remembered. Well, I only began to, as I say, sort of stumble into this back in 2000, 2002, led to work on the campus, partly because I was interested in social space. I was looking around for examples. There's a famous statement by the great French sociologist that the most powerful ideas in society, Pierre Bourdieu likes to say, they go without saying, because they come without saying. They're embedded in space. So I thought, well, why don't we just walk through the community? And Mr. Godfrey and other members of the community, including white members of the community, took us through what they considered the most important place in town, which was the cemetery. And the students were overwhelmed that the histories that they were hearing about were so very different. And they were hearing stories about slavery from leaders of the white community. They were hearing that slavery at Emory, at Oxford, was a benevolent institution, a form of sort of social welfare. From African Americans, they were hearing stories of enormous pain, suffering, great pride in the accomplishments of the community, but always tempered by a kind of a sad and somber recognition of what had come before. Some of you are familiar with the city of Oxford, Georgia, the birthplace of Emory University. And the area that we'll be talking about is in the upper northeast quadrant. You'll see there's an African-American cemetery and a white cemetery, and that's what really led us into this. The white Oxford Cemetery really was a marvelous living laboratory for teaching and research, as many of us began to understand that what looked like a very beautiful place also contained a hidden history of expropriation, the expropriation of land and resources and so forth. It's the Westminster Abbey of Georgia Methodism, and many people like to say, one of the interesting classroom exercises we did, we came across this fascinating epitaph in memory of Mary, wife of Reverend Osborne Rogers. You can see embraced religion, August 12, 1812. So you get that sense of the seriousness of the Methodist commitment. The morning before her death, she called her family, white and black, around her and bade them farewell. From that time, as long as she could be understood, she continued to praise God. Our students who were freshmen, first and second years undergraduates at Oxford, were fascinated by this line. What did it mean to say, calling a family together white and black? This was a family that was on the one hand deeply committed to evangelism. They were in fact teaching enslaved African Americans to read, which was against the law at the time, and yet they were proud defenders of the institution of slavery, and a few years later would sacrifice many of their members in the Confederate struggle to preserve, among other things, the institution of slavery. The students were fascinated by these ironies and paradoxes. They began to read different kinds of accounts of the enslaved, often referred to as servants, and wondering who were they? Who were their stories? Especially the story of Miss Kitty. As some of you know, there's been an attempt to almost monumentalize or memorialize a particular enslaved woman who was owned by Bishop James Osgood Andrew, the first president of the Board of Trustees, the man more responsible than anyone for the founding of this university of Emory. His ownership of slaves in 1844 became an issue, a front page issue in the national media, because as a bishop, northern delegates to the great 1844 Methodist Conference in New York, there's a lot of church history in here, were flabbergasted to discover that a Methodist bishop, in what they had always assumed was an anti-slavery faith, was in fact a slave owner. They requested that he desist from being a bishop as long as he was a slave owner. For white Southern delegates, this was a great attack upon Southern virtue and honor, and they walked out, leading to the great schism in the Methodist Church from 1845 all the way up until 1939. Now, nowadays, for many people, this seems a sort of arcane bit of history, but in fact, this was a profoundly important dress rehearsal for the coming Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant used to say there were 3 political parties in the United States if you counted the Methodists. Methodists were enormously important, and when Methodism unraveled over the issue of slavery, it was a sure sign for many people that the Union could not endure half slave and half free. So a great deal of history really swirls in on this little corner, Oxford. My students were also fascinated by Dooley. I don't know if Dooley's going to make an appearance today, but many of us I'm an Africanist by training and study Afro-Atlantic traditional religions, were fascinated by some of the fascinating parallels between Dooley and Baron Samedi, or Guédé, of a very important Afro-Atlantic figure associated with Verdun. How this happens, we're not quite sure, but it's a reminder of the complexities of race, right? Here's a figure who in some way embodies the essence of the institution, has particular associations, rather horrific ones, with the history of Night Riders and even of the Klan, and yet also is an appropriation of one of the great Afro-Atlantic religious traditions. There's a very strange ways when we begin to study race and power and slavery's legacies at a place like Emory that we find ourselves at a hall of mirrors confronting very different overlapping histories. Newton County, the county in which Emory was founded, was not one of the largest slave-owning counties in Georgia, but certainly had, by 1850, had 647 slave owners, most of them averaging about 10 to 12 enslaved people. So nothing like the size of the great coastal plantations or what was to develop in Alabama and Mississippi. And yet slavery, and yet they felt deep, the major figures associated with the institution of slavery, especially within the Methodist Church, many of them physicians and deeply thoughtful intellectuals, at the same time felt that slavery was under assault from Northern abolitionists. And one of the reasons really for the foundations of the creation of Emory was, of course, a place where Methodist clergy could be trained, where they hoped in time a medical training would develop as well, doing the Lord's work, and yet at the same time defending the institution of slavery. At a time in 1836, it's a time of enormous ferment. 1836, the very year that the Creek removal, the removal of Native American peoples from the land that we are now sitting on, took place, was also the founding of Emory, and a critical period as abolitionist sentiment becomes stronger in the North. So one of the reasons for the founding of Emory, unquestionably, is the ideological justification to train a generation that can proudly defend the institution of slavery. It's a utopian place in many ways, a beautiful design. As you can see, it's still a beautiful, precious gem of a campus, and yet it rests upon a particular history of labor exploitation. The choice to name the college after the recently deceased Bishop John Emory in Maryland had a lot to do with the fact that he was one of their own, really, for Methodist leaders in the South. He was a great proponent of a great critic of what was called radical abolitionism. Slavery would die out of its own accord. It should never be pushed along, certainly not by the federal government, he argued. For some reason, there's been a claim, often in the literature, that John Emory couldn't possibly have been a slave owner. Nonetheless, his will makes it quite clear, as you can see here. He frees some, not all, of his slaves under rather, this would seem to suggest he actually was a slave owner. So he's waiting after his death. He's following the example, in fact, of George Washington, as did a number of prominent Maryland and Virginia slave owners, not all that many, waiting after his death for them to be freed. But there's no question that slavery was just part and parcel of the early years of Emory College. Some enslaved people were held within the town of Oxford, others were at outlying plantations. It was also quite lucrative to rent them out. And at the same time, many of the great leaders of Emory, as we say, were really involved in the defense of the institution of slavery. And that's another interesting part. We're all committed, of course, to principles of academic freedom in a scholarly community. And yet there are, it seems to me, there are ethical and philosophical questions to reflect upon when we read, for example, the President Longstreet's letters, some of the most vociferous defenses of slavery ever penned, claiming that it was mandated in the Old Testament and the New Testament, These are really, and these are critical documents in the leading up to the war in many respects, and they are generated unquestionably out of Emory. Emory didn't own slaves. A number of colleges around the South did own slaves, of course, and the Georgia Railroad owned slaves. Emory found it more economically efficient to rent out slaves. If we go upstairs into special collections, we'll see these in the archives. Resolved that the treasurer be instructed to pay the sum of $50 for the hire of a Negro woman by the name of Sib, and to give notes for the hire of others. This was part of the way the Georgia Manual Labor College and the subsequent Emory College were, of course, built. We have tried over the years, and Oxford students have worked extremely hard on this, to identify many of the actual enslaved people, to go beyond the anonymous listing of numbers. And of course, it's very disturbing for young people to have to work through that numerical data, to see receipts paid to slave catchers, to see the listings and slave schedules and so forth, but to give names and identities. And that seems part of our ethical responsibility as we try to remember that these were not simply statistics, these were human beings with full and complex lives. But of course, the better records are, of course, of the Emory faculty and its officers. And we know a good deal now about who was enslaved. That's partly because there's a great chain of continuity, and many of the Oxford African American and Covington families have shared their memories and so forth. We know a little bit about free people. I'll talk a little bit about Dr. Alexander Means, who's really central to this story. A very important figure in medical education. This is an imaginative inventor and visionary in many ways, but always a slave owner and deeply committed to the defense of slavery. So he's involved really in the partially in the creation of scientific medicine in Georgia. And his livelihood is supported by enslaved people, and a good deal of medical knowledge that he gained came from his treatment of enslaved people that he owned. This just gives us a little vision of Emory College just on the eve of the Civil War. By the way, you'll see the students, many of whom will be serving. Let's just take one quick example. Some of you are familiar with some of these stories. Cornelius Robinson was probably one of the most privileged enslaved people, and for that reason we know more about him. He was Creek, we understand, at least partially. He served as a valet. His wife, Ellen, was the maid to Mrs. Means. Here we have a picture of them late in life with grandchildren. Quite remarkable to have this connection. Here's the beautiful house that was built with slave labor by many of these families, and of course serviced by enslaved people at the time that he was president of Emory. And we can go through the generations. It's quite exciting. The students have worked very hard on this. Also, going back to Bishop Andrew, just across the way, we've traced those family histories from James and then his son Tom. By the way, one of the ways we know a lot of this information about who was owned by Bishop Andrew is because of a very complicated legal maneuver that President Longstreet, who was reputed at that time to be the cleverest lawyer in Georgia, tried to get ready for this 1844 controversy when it was expected that the Northern delegates would, in fact, be upset that the president of Emory's Board of Trustees was a slaveholder. Tried to actually, for $10, he sold all 14 of his slaves to President Longstreet 2 weeks before the conference, and then who then actually deeded. We found the document showing that he then, a few minutes later, deeded them all back to the bishop, so that Bishop Andrew could actually stand up and claim he wasn't actually the owner of the slaves. It didn't work. The Civil War still happened, but they tried. Anyway, those two families that historically are so important, in fact, become married, and so in the next generation, Robert and Sarah are married, and then we come all the way down to the next generation, to Henry or Billy and Bob, and they're really quite important in the history of Emory College. Here's Sarah just a little bit further back. Here's Henry himself, the legendary groundskeeper, the person who, I think J.P. Godfrey can attest, really ran the college for a long time, a most remarkable gentleman. And it's fascinating. He was the groundskeeper, the janitor, really ran the physical plant for a very long time. One of the most beloved figures on campus, deep friends with some of the leading arch segregationists in the South. It's very fascinating. how he traversed these different worlds, deeply trusted. Generations of alumni recall coming back, really hoping to see him, descended from two of these very important enslaved families, and with a strong sense of custodialship and stewardship and pride in the college while being fully aware of a long history of exploitation. Here he is, as you can see, with some of the so-called Emory boys at alumni weekend and so forth. These are wonderful stories that have continued really through the generations. His daughter, Sarah Frances Mitchell Wise, worked so closely with our students, was a wonderful person. Her son also as well, who was a pathologist at the VA. So there are many connections to the medical histories here. And here's Sarah Frances, who we remember so much. But it's important to remember that while that's a relatively privileged line, there were many tragic stories. And I think as we ponder questions of apologies and restoration, we should remember that slavery was a complex, multi-tiered labor system in which enslaved people families were torn apart continuously. There were at times degrees of agency, of capacity to resist that we have to remember as well, that we're not talking about a history ever on the Emory campus of abject victimhood for all the tragedies. The example of Henry and Millie Robinson, I think, is important. We know about this again, if you were to, for students found it very moving working through the diaries upstairs of Alexander Means. Same time that he was the professor of chemistry, critical in the founding of the Atlanta Medical College, which eventually morphs into the Emory Medical School, he's fighting a little domestic battle. He had sent off his own son into the Confederate Army, and Henry had accompanied him as a valet, and also to protect him at the Battle of Manassas, of course, a great Confederate victory. Henry returns expecting to be treated somewhat heroically. I mean, he saved the life of his young master at least once, only to learn that Alexander Means has sold him and his entire family, his wife and children, to Judge Reynolds in Covington. And the fascinating thing is Henry is very upset. He actually manages, and on this we have to depend on oral history on the one side and also from Alexander Means' diaries. But everybody agrees, all these sources, that Henry put up enough of a fight that he was able to convince Alexander Means, Dr. Means, to relent and to get the contract canceled so that the family was not broken apart. Not entirely, though. It turns out that young Mildred, who was a young woman at the time, of extraordinary spirit, bravely told Dr. Means exactly what she thought of this audacity of tearing a family apart. And for that, he could not forgive her. He would allow pleading, but he would not. She stood up, looked him directly in the eyes, and told him that he was sinning in the face of God. And for that, she was sold off as punishment with her young son, her newborn baby. And on New Year's Day, we know that they have to walk themselves down for enslavement at the Reynolds place, and then they're promptly given off as a dowry present to Judge Reynolds' daughter and his new son-in-law, who then goes off and actually is killed in the Civil War. So we know a lot about that history. But we are also able to, and this is, I think, for the students, of course, were deeply invested in this particular story, as you can imagine, but then to learn in the 1870 census, the first Freedmen census, that the family was reunited. Mildred had found her way back. She now had a married name, although she not with a husband, and she's living with her parents and with her brothers and sisters again. So somehow the family had managed, in the very difficult and exciting period of Reconstruction, to reconnect, but there's no sign of that little baby, and we don't know what happened to that baby. And I think our students spent a lot of time actually thinking and even praying on that question of what happened to that child and so many other children. Did the child die? Was it sold in the course of the war? But there's absolutely no historical trace. And so as we celebrate the achievements of many of the great families, African-American families that come out of these enslaved communities, we have to remember all those that are lost and find a way somehow to honor them. Well, I'll move through many other dowry stories, as fascinating as there are. The stories of Professor George Washington Stone, Emory's very important professor of mathematics, because of the kindness of his descendants, who include Emory and Emory Dean, Dean Eady, and his children, we've been given really wonderful family documents that have allowed us to reconstruct multiple generations of enslaved people that were owned by that family. And it is very moving to be able to put names to these abstract numbers. One of them was a woman known as Louisa. When we worked out in the cemetery doing a restoration project collaboratively with the African American congregations, we found this headstone that had been long lost under the privet. Louisa, it says, and you notice just the first name, died November 2, 1882, faithful servant in the family of Professor G.W.W. Stone. And this has been put up by the family because she'd been owned. She actually had been married, though, to a man, Sam Means, who was owned by Dr. Means. And yet there was no sign of that on the headstone. The students wondered about that. But then a few days later, we were given a document, a memory coming through the Stone family. We all thought she was one of the best. He didn't actually use that N-word, not Negroes ever born. We think so yet. So it's fascinating. He actually writes, we couldn't have loved our own child, her own children, any more than she did us. That absolute assumption that the mammy really existed for the white children. A very pernicious myth, but one that was deeply believed here. And this fascinating line that just was so startling to us. He was a blacksmith and behaved himself until after the surrender. Then he was unkind to Louisa. He became too free. And that, of course, is this interesting story of Reconstruction and the backlash during the redemption period in which African American, of course, landowning, political participation, and so forth were enormously restricted. And for the students had learned about this in abstraction in the U.S. survey courses, but to actually see this in actual documents with people whose stories they were retelling. Anyway, we did then the next weekend, as we continued to uncover the privet, find on the other side, carved in a different hand, Louisa Means. And the family, and the story in the community is that her family had waited a while till after the white family, her former owners, who had continued to employ her, had carved it and done the dedication of the stone, and then went out quietly when nobody was looking to put in her full married name, because she was an important woman in the church. She didn't simply exist as a mammy, of course. And for us, I think this is one of the most extraordinary things, that headstone in which two sides of her identity, as it were, going back to a story that was enslaved, and another side that celebrated her marriage, that celebrated her leadership role in the community, those are still there. And these are good lessons, I think, for all of us. The students were very moved by this. We did learn a great deal about histories of faith. This was a deeply Methodist community, even during the time of slavery. Atticus Haygood, one of the great, of course, orators of the New South, states that he learned how to preach in the Oxford slave church, as he called it. He was assigned there as a young student, and these are. Of course, there's a long history of homiletics, of clerical training, and there's this interesting intertwining. Nonetheless, after 1865, after the Civil War, the formerly enslaved community, the new free community in Oxford, broke off from the Southern Methodist Church, the church that had supported slavery and the Confederacy, and joined up with the Northern Church to create Rest Chapel, as we'll talk about. We can come back to some of this very interesting history. The church actually, the old black church during slavery times was actually in the area that's now part of the white cemetery, and then after the Civil War, the white cemetery expanded, and the white church, and the African American church was taken down. We'll talk about some of these old stories. There are so many wonderful stories of the great leaders of the community coming out of slavery, who emerged by 1870 in the records as farm workers, and then quickly are purchasing somehow their own land. The college was sort of cash poor, but land rich after the war. And through very clever management of resources, sometimes rather autocratically enforced by some of the patriarchs in the African American community, many African American families did acquire a great deal of land and are still significant landowners in the Oxford area. So that's another interesting part of the story. One of the most enigmatic part of the stories is the story of Miss Kitty, who I mentioned briefly. She's the only person of color known to be buried in that Oxford cemetery. She lived her whole life enslaved. There's a claim made by many white historians in Emory's history that she wasn't really like a slave, because in 1841, Bishop Andrew attempted to free her. She didn't want to go off to Liberia, which was the only conditions under which she was offered freedom. And therefore, it is said she was allowed to build her own house, or for her husband to build her own house, and so forth. And therefore, she lived in virtual freedom until she passed 10 years later in 1851. There's enormous amount of controversy in the community to this day. This is a deeply sentimental story, I think, for many white Southern Methodists. And her grave site is almost a sort of pilgrimage spot, I think, where many whites have gone over the generations to sort of to be confirmed in their belief that slavery was a relatively benign institution, because after all, Kitty, it's asserted, chose of her own free will to remain in slavery out of loyalty to her white master and mistress. That story is understood very differently, as you might imagine, in the African American community. Alternate questions. There's an alternate understanding, by the way, of the question of who was the actual father of Miss Kitty's children. Was it, in fact, an enslaved man named Nathan? Was it perhaps even Bishop Andrew? There's a great deal of debate that has raged around this. One of my students, Keith McGill at Oxford, has tried to imagine her visually, and we'll hear in a few minutes from another artist who is engaging in this process. Nobody, of course, really knows what she looks like. Here's Bishop Andrew himself. And their relationship is something we need to ponder. We may never know the exact facts, but this is one of the great enigmas, because it's impossible to read a history of Emory or even a history of Methodism without some discussion of Bishop Andrew and his relations with the enslaved people. There's even a monument to her that goes up in 1939. At the same time, her slave quarters, in which the quarters in which she'd been enslaved, were transported in 1938 to an all-white segregated Methodist campground, to Salem Campground. And I think there is a sense here, visually, we get a sense, if you can forgive the anthropological interpretation, that by the white community, and this was really done by Bishop Candler, who of course was the chancellor of Emory, and his friend H.W. McCord, a very powerful member of the Board of Trustees of Emory, really saw that this was a vital issue in 1939. They were concerned over the New Deal. They were concerned over what they perceived as threats to the segregationist order and the reunification of the Methodist Church nationally. And so they felt it important to safeguard the honor of Emory, which meant safeguarding the story of Southern white beneficence. And if you read this story, it's insisting that slavery was a benign institution, and that it's really only until once there's external influence that things became a problem. So that's the boundary marker, actually, at this cemetery. It's a very fascinating and complex place, and we can talk about the positioning of it and so forth. It more or less marks off the distinction between the African-American cemetery and the white cemetery. Many white community members have invested a great deal of loving time and effort in the restoration of the slave quarters. It was actually initially turned from 1939 to 1994. It was a lost cause, a neo-Confederate museum over at Salem. That it comes back. It becomes a sort of more sentimental sort of museum space. And many members of the Oxford Historical Shrine Society, a nearly all-white organization, remain puzzled that African-American residents of Newton County have not chosen to walk inside it. And it's one of those interesting gulfs still that is something to think about as we think about the history of Emory, that this place, which for many whites has seemed like a place of love, of sentimental connectedness across the racial lines, is understood very differently by many local African Americans who have understood it as a place of violation, of betrayal, and so forth. Enormous amount of pain. Our students were at that time reading Beloved, and the lines, as they were trying to understand why it was so hard for so many people to walk into that slave quarters, when Sethe says to Denver, if you go there and stand in the place where it was, it will happen again. It will be there for you, waiting for you. Those lines, of course, by Toni Morrison, are deeply resonant as we think, how do we mark certain places? How do we acknowledge them? But how do we also acknowledge the necessity for some people not to do that particular walk, but to find other ways of passing on stories, of passing on knowledge? Ironically, the all-white Cemetery Foundation, which at that point was maintaining, as late as 2000, a segregated cemetery, decided to place, without any consultation with the African American community, a headstone, finally acknowledging for the first time that Kitty had actually been buried, probably next to Bishop Andrew, which had been seen as sort of a too sensitive in the 1930s. Still lots of questions, and the whole question of what name is used for her. By the way, there's a long history we could talk about of enslaved people who were buried against their will and against their family wills in the plots of masters. We do have some wonderful evidence of Miss Kitty's life right here in the Emory Library in special collections. This grocery book that shows, if you can just see at the bottom, J.O. Andrew for Kitty. In other words, Kitty is signing with an X. It's fascinating, though. We do know from her obituary that she was literate, that she could read and write, actually read quite well. But for some reason, going into that particular store, she chooses not to let anyone know that she's literate. And we may want to think about that. Well, there's so many controversies about Kitty. I'll mention there's been an attempt by Afrocentric, especially Yoruba-influenced practitioners, to sort of liberate, as they see it, the Emory campus. They came in here a few years ago for Juneteenth, poured out libations, tried to appease her spirit, to give her a new African name. Caused some consternation in some parts of the town, if I recall correctly. Is that and so there and in a sense, but we have some new news. I'll just share quickly with you. My students had always, and many members of the community, had really wanted to know what happened to her children. We knew that they were taken away taken away from Oxford, taken away from Emory in 1855 after their mother died. After Kitty died, there were two boys and a girl, and we've had some lucky breaks. In my research, her eldest son became a stayed in the Methodist tradition, but not within the Southern Methodist Church. He became a pastor in the African Methodist Episcopal Church and spent his entire career, it turns out, in Iowa and Illinois. He became a cook attached to the Union Army, to the great shock of the Andrew family that really believed that her children would be eternally loyal. The second son made his way up to Washington, D.C., and actually became, in time, a very distinguished librarian at the U.S. Department of State. And he passed in 1921, and also was the senior deacon at 15th Street Presbyterian with Reverend Francis Grimke, very involved, of course, at that exciting period with the formation of the NAACP. So really quite a fascinating family history, although we have lost so much. It's much harder to find out what happened to her daughter. And so forth. But anyway, through a series of other lucky breaks, we have now been able to trace her great-great-grandson, a very elderly gentleman, and his daughters, who now live in a northeastern state, and they have decided that they would love to come down back here to Emory to finally see everything. So they're going to come down in February, Lord willing, and Reverend Murphy has graciously invited them to Grace United Methodist Church, where they'll be welcomed on February 6th, the first Sunday in Black History Month, which is also Founders Week, the 175th anniversary of Emory, and that's a chance for all of us to welcome them back home. So that's quite moving. These are wonderful stories. Some of the stories, of course, of slavery at Emory are so heartbreaking, they still bring tears to your eyes. These are receipts that the students discovered in the basement of the courthouse, paid to slave catchers towards the very end of the Civil War, when enslaved families were escaping, in this case from the Cody plantation, coming in this direction, that is to say, towards federal lines, risking artillery fire as they were coming, and they were captured in Rockdale County and Conyers, in other words, in between the Emory campus and Atlanta. And in some cases, it was mothers, as you can see here, mothers bringing small children. And our students were really nervous about this. What do you do with this? Does this mean that if we were to exhibit this kind of a receipt, is this telling a story, the students asked, that somehow we were blaming the mother for putting her child at risk? So we had a great meeting that Mr. Godfrey and others helped to organize with the leaders of the community at the local African American churches at Mount Zion and Rust and others came, and the students presented this question, and it was a very interesting learning experience as they had to think through, and they really were told this was too important not to share, but this information had to be done in the right way, that the families had to be treated with dignity. because they were saying something extremely important, that quest for freedom, that longing of, and also that, W.E.B. Du Bois used to point out that one of the first great general strikes in American history was the decision by thousands of African Americans to self-liberate themselves, to not simply wait till federal troops came. And that's this story here of a decision by a mother to take fate into her own hands because she did not want her children to live another day in freedom, leaving Oxford. We came across other disturbing documents in which another mathematics professor, Professor Orr, was in the process of inventing sharecropping in a sense. But the contract's very interesting. But I'll just mention that that all of these sharecroppers in Oxford, as opposed to other parts of the state of Georgia, managed to work their way out of sharecropping fairly quickly through acquisition of land and investing very quickly in education. Which was really, the mode of class mobility. So it's quite a remarkable story. There is that centers upon faith and a commitment to education. Russ Chapel United Methodist Church is the result on the Methodist side of that. We have this beautiful photograph. We're still working on identifying everybody in it of former enslaved people, now freed people. And the other generation, holding up those the loved ones that have passed in photographic form. It's a remarkable. You really get a sense of the dignity and the strength and the power of this community. These are families that continue to work in many cases at Emory College in all manner of jobs, and took great pride in the college. We're working very hard to send their children to Payne, to Clark Atlanta. But we're always aware that the college that they cared for and whose labor their ancestors and they themselves, in a sense, had made possible, still had its closed doors and was going to remain closed until a very, of course, heroic group of African American students are the pioneers who finally lead to the desegregation of the college in the 1960s. I'm going to move forward through all of this. The students were very concerned over the injustice in the cemetery. They worked hard collaboratively to document where the graves of enslaved people and their descendants were, planted flowers, documented those locations. It was a nice research project, creating a website and so forth. But at a certain point, the students got tired of just straight research and actually said, but this is wrong. It is wrong that African Americans, the descendants of the people that built Emory, are still denied the rights to have their graves looked after. They paid the same fees for perpetual care as everybody else, and yet it turned out through a sort of bookkeeping arrangement that funding was being transferred by the city council over to an all-white private foundation set up after the Civil Rights Act. It's a long story. Here we see, actually, the day in which we actually uncovered J.P. Godfrey's grandfather's and grandmother's marker, an open Bible, a fantastically moving moment for us all. But the student said, yes, this discovery is important, but justice is really critical. And there's one of the most enigmatic of all photographs in the history of Emory and Oxford. There is Israel Godfrey, born a slave in Alabama, sitting at the Branham and Candler family reunions, among the most powerful families in the history of Georgia and in, of course, the history of Emory, and he's sitting there like he owns the place. So there are many mysteries still to uncover. Here's Sally Sims Godfrey, his son, the educator, J.P. Godfrey Sr. Wonderful stories, J.P. himself, who was then serving on the city council. Students worked on this dedication, all these wonderful stories of educators, of physicians, of John Graves, who comes out of this family, who was a chef here on the university campus. This led to a university process, but then also working hard with some help by our friends in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution to really advocate for the desegregation of the cemetery and a new contract, which finally in 2001 has led, and since then has really led to new resources being more properly shared. But I quickly want to touch on the other side, half of the story, which is Emory's profound involvement as a medical institution from its inception, really, and especially beginning in the 1850s with the founding of the Atlanta Medical College. And this story, too, is deeply grounded in slavery. I'll just mention this quickly. We can talk more about this in a moment. It's a complicated map. It's a little hard to see this. Some of you know the very different ways that the Atlanta Medical College and the Southern Medical College come together, all leading up eventually to the foundation in 1915 of the Emory University School of Medicine. But all these institutions do have their roots in slavery in many different ways. The founding faculty, including our friend Auslander Means, you'll see there, were primarily slave owners. Their economic practice, in a sense, their medical practice as well, depended a great deal on slavery. And here I'm indebted to the work of Marietta Collins and others who have really been the pioneers in this history of race and power in the medical system here. So John Westmoreland, who of course is the first dean of the medical college, is the trustee of. He doesn't technically own, but he's realizing all the profits from 24 slaves. John Jones, who was the professor of the theory and practice of medicine, owns at least 3 slaves in 1860. Alexander Means owned 22 slaves. And L.P. Grant, who gives the great land, he was the head of the Georgia Railroad, which itself owned lots of slaves, owned at least 5 slaves in 1860. So slave owning and a deep sense of religious and spiritual purpose that was fulfilled through a medical mission. These were not seen as inconsistent at the time, although, of course, the nation itself was being convulsed over this question. So it's important to remember that. There's a more complicated question, which is very fascinating, as one begins to read through the Atlanta Medical and Surgical Journal from the founding of the medical college in 1854. How much medical knowledge is actually being developed through the treatment of enslaved people? The journals are just full of this, and it's interesting. They're actually advertising, the college is advertising from its founding, asking slave owners to bring in slaves for treatment because so much medical knowledge is really being gained. There are, as you read through the journal also, and this is one of the things I find most fascinating, is that there are times, of course, when ironically, of course, enslaved people are always just a Negro woman or sometimes by first name. The white person to whom they belong is just Mrs. Blank because her privacy has to be protected, even while the most intimate of all anatomical and personal stories by the enslaved are being revealed. But in many cases, there are instances in which an enslaved person seems to argue back with the physician and sometimes suggests certain possible remedies, certain possible interpretations, and occasionally the white physicians acknowledge that they learned something through those conversations, even at the same time as they're writing in other publications, insisting on separate creation, that whites and blacks are of separate species and so forth. So there are many difficult contradictions in this, but it's interesting to think that in addition to the extraction of labor, we know there's a great deal of extraction of intellectual knowledge in terms of irrigation and the knowledge of plant genetics and so forth, going on in Georgia in this period, but there may also be an interesting kind of extraction of African medical knowledge, and that I think is one of the most exciting areas for future research. We'll move through. We can return to the fascinating story of Emory's growing involvement as an institution with Grady, with what comes to be known as the Negro Hospital, the Emory division of Grady Memorial Hospital. Stories in which great scientific advances are being made, in which African Americans, especially low-income ones, are being offered care, but often obviously under profoundly unequal circumstances. There are many, many stories we could review in which this long-term legacy, these spaces built exactly on top of the old Atlanta Medical College that are now part of the Grady campus, are sites of unbelievable tragedy. Of course, there's a famous story of Walter White, president of the NAACP, his own father, his own light-skinned father, who was struck down by an Atlanta motorist, taken to Grady, taken into the white part of Grady, initially treated well until it became clear to the white physicians that he was a person of color, at which point he's moved across the street to the woefully inadequate facilities. And of course, this story was really repeated hundreds, thousands of times in terms of unequal treatment. And now there's a great deal of work and thinking with the creation, the same year that Brown, of course, the Brown decision is formulated. Emory is involved with the opening of the so-called separate but equal hospital that we all know, the H-shaped building with supposedly equal white and, quote, colored wings. Many of these are wonderful photographs, of course, that are visible as you enter now. Grady of the pharmacy, of important work that's done, the marvelous history, of course, in the School of Nursing under very difficult circumstances, the generations of nurses. So all of these stories still kind of swirl around a place like Grady, and I think this is some of the most exciting frontier collaborative interdisciplinary work to be done, reflecting on, that takes us back to, in many ways, to the founding Methodist spirit, which is something that we can honor at one level, a commitment to healing the body and the soul, which was an important part of John Wesley's even original message, and yet that message fell short in many ways because the fulfillment of that promise was predicated upon a profoundly unequal race-based system of labor exploitation, which has continued in many complicated ways, and which continues to be debated as we all ponder race and class-related disparities in health and access to resources at Grady, one of the great public urban health institutions, which is under, obviously, systematic siege in so many ways. So where does this leave us very quickly? The apology question, what form statements of acknowledgement might take, questions of physical memorials, perhaps. The scholar Arthur Danto likes to say, we build monuments so we will always remember. We build memorials so we shall never forget. So what's called for here? What would be a physical memorial or perhaps a living memorial? Well, a few other colleges have tackled this, perhaps not very successfully. University of North Carolina tried to do this. They have seriously explored their own slavery-based past. They created, and I apologize, this should be brighter, but it's a little hard to see. They created a table here, but they're little people holding it up. It's to honor the unsung founders, and yet it's hard to see, but those are actually men and women holding it up. And the sculptor, who was from Korea, and perhaps not sufficiently familiar with the iconography of race in the United States, I think didn't understand that he was inadvertently or accidentally reproducing the Blackamoor furniture. We're all familiar with lots of furniture from the 19th century in which African American slaves are showed holding things up. So it's not an entirely, the idea is interesting, but the idea of people still having their picnics sitting on top of enslaved people, it doesn't quite work as a monument, was I think the feeling. Well, it's easy to criticize, but what would be a solution? So we're really lucky to have with us today the noted artist Lynn Marshall Linnemeyer, who has been conceiving a project, and here she is, that might honor Miss Kitty and all of the enslaved people and their descendants, the people of color who have been critical in the creation of this institution, even at some of the darkest periods in the institution's history when access to those institutional resources was not made fully available. So I'd like us to acknowledge, and here Lynn has shared one of her images. Lynn, could I ask you to come on up for a moment? Would that be all right? Do you want to say something a little? I know it's very early. It's a terrible thing to do in an artist, to make them talk about the work before you've even made it yet.
Yeah, it is. We have collaborated on a couple of pieces, and this one, when he first told me this story, I was very struck by the story of Catherine Boyd, who I don't refer to as Kitty, but let's just suffice it to say we'll name the piece Unraveling Miss Kitty's Cloak. And so, in thinking about how do I connect one side of the cemetery with the other side of the cemetery, because I think that there's the division there between the two communities, and I've been working, I just finished a project in Madison, Georgia, called Mapping the Present Just Went By, a journey through Black Morgan County, Georgia. And in that particular piece, I created a masquerade costume that pays homage to ancestors. It's called an agon, and this is the piece. The slide's very dark, but this is the piece that was was presented. What happened on this project, Mark came down, I think it was, you were down doing research, and he's so funny, he just whisked you off. He says, let's go to the Georgia archives. And I said, okay. And so we went to the archives. He went one way and I went another. I was looking for some genealogical information on a friend of mine from Madison. And Mark disappeared, and I sat there at the computer trying to find Ollie's family, and Ollie was a mentor on this project. And Mark came back and he says, "You'd never believe what I found." And I was like, "Oh, yes, I would." Because he's very, very adamant about this research. But anyway, what he uncovered was almost 200 names of slaves that had been brought into Morgan County in 1818, just 9 years after the county was founded. And these names had never been revealed before. There was a great deal of denial in Morgan County. But anyway, I was so excited. I've been working with the archivist in Morgan County, and Mark knew him, Woody Williams, and his daughter-in-law. And so anyway, we were on the phone calling, "Mr. Woody, you'll never believe what we found." And we were on our way to, back to Atlanta. He says, "Go back and find those original documents." And we never did find the original documents, but we did have the names. And apparently it was a project with the Mormon community back in 1954, I think. So what I did was I created an agan, which is a costume that is worn it's a Yoruba tradition, and you saw there were some Yoruba traditional things that were going on around the cottage. But ours was a little bit different. Mine was a little bit different. I actually created the costume that would have been worn in the Agan, in the Agungun ceremony, Agungun meaning ancestors. And so what I did was I took those names, I printed them on fabric, and I sewed those names into this costume. So it contains the names of those enslaved persons and their owners who were brought into Morgan County. In addition to that, one of the other things that I did, we set up a table in the gallery space. And there's another layer to this because I found an envelope full of obituaries. I didn't find them, actually, this guy had them. And we wound up going to his house, and Meat, that's his nickname, had a whole bag of obituaries that dated back to 1970s. And so anyway, I blew those up and placed them on the wall in the gallery space, created this agan, sewed the names into the piece, and then set up a table in the gallery space where people could come in and write about ancestors that had passed away. And when I returned, I guess about a month later, because the show was up for a couple of months, when I returned a couple of months later, what was so beautiful was people had left memories about those who had gone on before them, because everybody has an ancestor. Every living thing on the planet has an ancestor. A roach has an ancestor. I was talking to students at Spelman, and I told them, you may not like them, they're not your friends, but even roaches have ancestors now, But anyway, what was so beautiful was that people left messages about their ancestors in that piece. So I think that the challenge for me in doing this piece around Kitty is to figure out how to create a piece like that will embrace or cause both sides of the community to be embraced. And that's actually one of the, right now I'm working on sketches, because of course no one knows what Kitty looks like. The idea is that Catherine was probably a very beautiful woman. And one of the things that I just said was trying to connect the two sides of the community. One idea was to build an agan and to have the strips of fabric actually go from one side of the cemetery to the other. If you're familiar with, oh God, why can't I think of his name? I'm talking about AT&T commercial. It was the band that raps everything. Christo. Kind of along those lines of where you actually wrap a cemetery. You're gonna have senior moments. I don't have gray hair for nothing. But to kind of wrap the cemetery. We spent the day yesterday in Covington. I attended 2 church services in one day. I thought that was pretty cool. I went to the Methodist church, and then we went to the Baptist church. My granddaughter says she prefers the Baptist church. No offense. No offense, Pastor. She's 11. But in any event, we went to 2 churches yesterday and then came and spent the whole day in Oxford and Covington. And one of the things that when I went to Grace Methodist, and I was very touched by that service, we actually attended the whole service there, was the interaction between the congregation and the children. I really liked that. And so I expressed to Mark that, young people would definitely be a part of that. I love the aisles in the church became an inspiration for me because you basically have to walk down these aisles. And so I was telling Mark, I said, it would be nice if we could measure the length of these aisles and maybe create some type of fabric piece that would maybe run through the length of aisles in the different churches and the communities. There's one thing that happened in Morgan County was that I found that the churches were very, very important because they are, these wonderful social spaces where people gather. So right now it's all in the planning.
Great.
And,
Great.
we'll
It's
see.
exciting.
It is.
So,
We'll see.
So now we have a few minutes really to open up the conversation for questions or thoughts or reflections on this history. We could talk about more about the apology and the memorial questions or other things that are on your mind.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.